Hi everybody, this is Laura. Thank you so much for joining me on my channel. Today I have a layout that I made using the January Shimmerz Color Kits collection. At this point, I had the idea of having two vertical strips of pattern paper on the right-hand side of the layout and then a horizontal one along the bottom of the layout. I don't end up doing that, but the mixed media background that I'm creating now goes along just fine with the composition that I end up using. Whenever I make a mixed media background for one of my layouts, I use thick white cardstock. This is 120-pound smooth cardstock. I have it already coated with some gesso. I have a small stack of papers that I keep handy for this purpose. And then I drew some pencil lines where I thought the strips of paper were going to go. And now I'm adding some Shimmerz paints to the background. For this layout, I use a spritz called Cotton Candy. It was such a beautiful, bright pink color. I added several layers using the packaging technique. I use my heat tool and I dry each layer. And then once I had a large area of color, I began adding some splatters. Those pencil lines come in really handy. I find that they really help me to have an idea of where to put the color on the background. Sometimes I think I don't need them, and then when I attempt to add the color, I either don't add enough or I add too much. When I added the splatters to the background, I thought that I had enough color, but then I decided I wanted to add a little bit more. So once again, I use the packaging technique and I add another layer of color. Then I use my heat tool and I dry that area of color. I know that I want to add a lot of splatters to the background. I like to make sure that the background is fully dry before I add splatters. That way you'll be able to see the distinct splatters on the background. Otherwise, the splatters will just kind of get absorbed by that last layer of color. And although that can make a cool effect too, you won't be able to see the individual splatters. For this layout, I wanted to have a lot of splatters, so I continue to add them. I add them to the entire area of color, but I also like to get a nice border of splatters all around the edge of the area of color. That way you could really see those splatters against the white background. And you can see that I go on for quite a while adding quite a few splatters to this background. And I don't show all the footage of the splatters, but I just kept doing the same thing until I was happy with the quantity that I had. Now I'm using some Staz On Ink in jet black and a small text stamp that I had in my stash. I'm not really sure who the manufacturer was. It might be Prima, but I can't be sure. And I'm adding some stamping. I'm mainly putting the stamping around the outside edge just because I know that my photos are going to go in the center. Now I'm using a rather old, maybe even vintage Stampin' Up! Stamp. It has a series of dots on it, and I really like the effect that that adds. Even though I know that I'm going to add some black splatters later, I like the idea of having some black dots. I find that my text stamps and my dot stamps are some of the staples in my stamp collection. I don't use too many stamps, but there are certain background stamps that I use over and over again. And this is another one. I think this is a Tim Holtz stamp. It came in a set, and it's a little mesh stamp, and I like the way that looks in conjunction with the other stamps. As I mentioned, I knew that I was going to be adding some black splatters. I'm using some Color Splash in Black Hole to add the splatters to this background. You can see I'm tapping my scissors against the top of the holder for the straw, and this creates some very tiny splatters, and I think they are a good complement to those stamped dots that I put on a little bit earlier. I used my heat tool to dry all of those black splatters, and then I added some modeling paste to the background. I accidentally put out some black acrylic paint because the black acrylic paint tube was white, and I didn't realize that it was marked black, so I have a little bit of that out. And then I added some white acrylic paint to my table along with some modeling paste. I mixed the two together, the white paint and the modeling paste, not the black paint. And I used to do that a long time ago when I was using a modeling paste that was more gray than white. And I've been doing that again lately, and I have to say I highly recommend adding a little bit of white paint in. It really makes the modeling paste much whiter, and I like the contrast between that and the mixed media background. The stencil that I'm using is by the Crafters Workshop. It's called Mini Specimens. It had a number of images on it, some circles and some butterflies and some others, but I decided I just wanted to use the circular images on this background. About halfway through, I dried the background just to make sure that when I put on another round of stenciling, that I didn't smear the first round of stenciling with the stencil, which happens to me every now and then. And you can see that I added an image. I didn't like the way it came out, and I just scraped that away and added it again. Then once again, I used my heat tool and I dried the background. Now I'm adding some more stenciling using a second stencil by Stamperia. Hope I'm saying that correctly. This stencil has a lot of kind of irregular dots, and I thought it would be a nice complement to the other stencil. I'm not adding a ton of it. I'm just adding it in a couple of spots that I wanted to fill in, both between the other stenciling and then sometimes slightly overlapping the stenciling I already did. It doesn't look too bad to me right now, but there was a little spot on the left-hand side of the layout that I thought needed a little bit of attention. I added a little bit more of the cotton candy spritz on top of it. I dried that. Then I add a little bit more of the stamping on top of that, just so that it would match in with the rest of the background. And now I'm adding just a little bit more of the stenciling on top of it too, again, to make it match in. And then I wanted to add just a little bit more of the color on top of all those layers. And then while I was adding the color there, I was thinking that I needed a little bit more color in the left-hand corner of that area of color. It just kind of looked like it was cut short, and I wanted to round out that area. So just like I did on the other spot, I added a little bit more color. I added some stamping, and now I'm adding some watered down white acrylic paint to the entire background, especially where I have the area of pink color. I really like to add white splatters to my mixed media backgrounds, and I usually add quite a few splatters. And then once I added the white acrylic paint, I let the background dry for quite a while, just because it takes a little bit longer for that white acrylic paint to dry. I had a scrap of blue paper that I decided that I would cut into banners to see if I liked that before I cut the pattern paper into that shape. And I decided that I did want to have 2 large banners on the bottom and then 2 smaller ones in the upper left-hand corner. I didn't intend to actually use those pieces of paper on the layout, but I do use some of them. I thought that the color matched really well, not only with the pink in the background, but also with the sweatshirt that my daughter is wearing. I have a piece of black and white striped pattern paper on the bottom. I'm also going to use that same paper for one of the small banners in the upper left-hand corner. And then for the other horizontal banner, I'm using a piece of pattern paper. I just had 1 strip of it left because I used the majority of it in the first layout that I made this month. I was going to use the more solid pink side of it, but then when I flipped it over, I saw that there was a grid on the other side, and I liked that side better. I was afraid that the pink paper would match in too much with the mixed media background, and since they were going to be very close to each other, I decided that the grid would be better than the pink paper. So I mounted that strip of paper on the blue paper that I had cut out earlier. And then I mounted the black striped piece of paper on some black cardstock. I used Distress ink in black soot and Distress Oxide in picked raspberry to ink the edges of both of those strips before I attached them down to the paper that I matted them on. And then once I had all 4 of those banners inked and matted, I placed them down in the layout, but I haven't yet attached them down. I'm going to add some border strips on the top and the bottom of the layout. I have a very thin strip of the black and white striped paper. I wanted to put that across the top of the layout. I also had some border strips that I punched out for another layout, and then I didn't end up using them, and they ended up working, I thought, really well on this layout. I have 2 strips that are a large scallop. I'm using one on the top and one on the bottom. I'm also using a smaller scallop that has a little hole in it on the top, and I'm layering those 3 border strips together. But first I inked the edges of them with the picked raspberry Distress Oxide so that they would match the rest of the layout. I also mounted that very thin strip of black and white striped paper on some black cardstock. That way it would match with the 2 banners on the page. And then I layered that at the very top of those 2 pink strips. I have most of the major elements placed down in the layout, although I haven't attached anything down at this time. Before I start attaching things down, I use some Distress Oxides in Tumbled Glass and Stormy Sky to ink the edges of those banners that I have matted with the blue paper. I have the title Happy Days in the upper left-hand corner of the layout. I'm going to end up moving that around. And I took that sticker and I stuck it down on a piece of white cardstock, and then I cut around it. That way I could move it around the page easily. It also made it a little bit sturdier, which came in handy later on when I popped it up on some foam. Right now I'm adding a little bit of dimension just to the photo on the left, since that one's going to be layered over the other photo. I'm using some self-adhesive fun foam and then some ATG adhesive to attach it down. However, I will be using some permanent glue later on to attach it down because the ATG adhesive is just a temporary adhesive on the foam. It will hold paper down indefinitely, but not foam. The reason I don't use the glue immediately is that I like to move things around the page, or at least have the option to move things around the page. And then later on, when I'm sure that the layout is complete, I will glue them down. I have a number of embellishments that I'm going to put on the layout. A number of them have been fussy cut out from the pattern papers. Some of them are from the stickers, and some of them are die cuts. I inked the edges with Distress Oxides. I matched the color to the embellishment. I used Bundled Sage, Picked Raspberry, and Stormy Sky. I'm going to begin adding those embellishments in a moment. First, I wanted to attach the title down to the page. I did put some foam behind it. Now I'm adding some photo corners to my photos, something that I love to do. I used an EK Success photo corner punch. I used the same blue cardstock that I used to mat the banners for the photo corners. Now I'm adding all of my embellishments to the page. Most of them were fussy cut from the pattern papers, the flowers, those black and white rainbows, the yellow stars, those are all fussy cut. In this month's kit, we received some circular embellishments. They're called dots. They're nice and shiny. I love adding them to pages. There's one with a yellow star on top of the cluster that's over the photo on the right. I also incorporated some die cuts into this layout. I used a vase with some flowers in the cluster that's to the left of my two photos. And then I made a small cluster under the photo on the right. There's a die cut large pink arrow. There are also some yellow stickers that I layered on top. And then I included the word smile. That was also included in the kit. And I attached all of these elements down with some ATG adhesive. I fussy cut a whole bunch of these tiny little blue flowers from one of the pattern papers. I thought they were so pretty, and I kind of sprinkled them all around the mixed media background. I also add them in a couple of other places just so that the whole layout will look cohesive. Then once I had placed all of those tiny blue flowers down on the background, I used my ATG gun and I attached all of them down to the page. I really like the way these tiny blue flowers broke up that pink background. I think that the pink and the blue are a really nice combination too. I found I had a very thin strip of pink paper, so I inked the edges of it and then I attached it down below the scalloped border on the bottom. I inked the edges of a pink heart from the die cut pack and I attached it down to the right hand side of the photos. And then I found the tiniest white enamel dots that I could, and I attached those down to the center of all of those blue flowers. I also put some black enamel dots on the page. I put a slightly larger one on the longer banners and then a smaller one on the shorter banners. Then I used 3 of the largest white enamel dots that I had, and I put those on 3 of the flowers. I added some pink enamel dots to the photo corners. I like that combination of the pink and the blue. I added a couple more of those little tiny blue flowers where I thought they were needed. And then I once again added the enamel dots so that they would look like the other little flowers on the page. I didn't have any enamel dots that were big enough for the centers of those green flowers, so I used some big sparkly self-adhesive jewels that I had in my stash. And that is the last touch. This layout is complete, and here are some close-ups. When you place an order with Shimmerz Paints, please make sure to use my name in the comments. That way you'll receive a free gift. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to watch this video. I really appreciate it, and I hope that you enjoyed watching. If you would like to purchase this kit or check out any of the other products that Shimmerz Paints has to offer, take a look in the description box where you'll find a link to their website. I hope you have a fantastic day, and I hope to see you again soon, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.